Fighting Noise, a nonoise podcast. Welcome back to the Fighting Noise podcast, the show that supports innovation against noise and its consequences. Silence can be a danger. So what if the future of transport wasn't just electric, but also safer and better sounding? What if, in our cities, trees might be our best noise barriers? Today's guest is working at the heart of both, and many more. Hello, Grant Waters.
Hi, Julien. Thanks for having me.
I'm really glad you're here today. I have a lot of questions for you, Grant, and we have a lot of topics to move on. But first, I have a question for you. Can you remember a moment in the city when the sound or even the silence completely changed how you felt in that place?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say it goes back to my time in around 2015, maybe a bit earlier. I was living in London and working as an acoustic consultant, so working in noise all the time. And I kind of just got a bit burnt out, as many people do. And I felt like actually it just leads on to kind of the work that we're doing now. But I gravitated towards green spaces and spaces where I could get a bit of respite, get away from it a bit. I remember this place in northeast London called Woodbury Wetlands, and it just turned into a nature reserve. A couple of reservoirs, one you could go swimming in, one you could do boating in. I didn't do boating, but people could. And then the other one was where it's kind of left for nature. And I remember walking through there, and it was on my way home, and I just that spot, I was like, this is within the city. This is within an urban environment, like one of the biggest cities in the world. But yet I'm hearing these sounds of nature, and it felt quiet to me, even though it wasn't necessarily quiet. But it felt quiet, and I think for me it was a lot to do with the mindset, the state of mind that I was in, as well as the physical environment. And that's where a lot of to be honest, that place is where I started the concept around Tranquil City, because it's very much about what your mindset is in that space, how you're perceiving that sound, and how you feel about it, and how it affects you. So kind of all intertwined. So I would say it wasn't particularly about the soundscape, even though it was a nice soundscape, but it was very much to do with how I was feeling at the time and my perspective on kind of urban living, and what I was going through.
And the place where all started. So let's start with you, Grant. Grant Lewis Waters, you are the founder of Tranquil City, but give us a bit more about that. Who are you, and what's Tranquil City as well?
Yeah, sure. So I'm an acoustic consultant by trade. I went into it with an interest, in schools around science. I was pretty good at science, but then I was also really involved in music and art to some degree. And I went into to study music technology and audio, and I realized that I wanted to do I wanted to get a job that I could do and enjoy. And I thought that working in the music industry wasn't my thing. So I really searched for different opportunities, and within my university degree, I found kind of the concept around acoustics and thinking about sound in buildings and sound in urban environments. And interestingly, back then in 2009, 2010, there was the concept around soundscapes introduced by my lecturers. I kind of batted it off as something not really interested in, but yeah, I'm an acoustic consultant. I've been working as an acoustic consultant for probably 12 odd years now.
Nice.
And yeah, it feels like it a long time. But then I founded Tranquil City in 2016, which was a concept around how you can start to question how cities can be supportive of health and well-being from a design perspective, but also how we behave and we live in them. And that is kind of dominated my work in the last nearly 10 years, which is around how we can create better sounding cities that are intertwined with kind of nature, that ultimately support us to live well in them, live sustainably in them, and support resilient cities. So that's who I am.
You are based in London, you said it, and you're mostly working with cities in the UK, I guess.
At the moment, we have done some work in Lisbon, for example. We've done some city stuff in Barcelona, and we've done various small projects in different cities. Yeah, primarily in the UK.
primarily in the UK, but still in Europe. Let's focus on the UK with the first example I wanted to discuss with you today. You had a very interesting work on in London on the well-known transport of London, the well-known buses and coaches of London. Silent buses, hidden risk, I say in the introduction, it's silence may be a danger. And electro buses have been introduced. They are really quiet, and then it can be a problem. So why, first of all, silence can be a problem? Can you picture that? And what has been your mission with transport for London to make them safer?
Yeah. It's such an interesting project. So electric vehicles are obviously where things are going in terms of trying to make transport more sustainable, efficient, healthy. But obviously there's various different complications around that and things around how they operate in our environment beyond the whole thing around their emissions. Obviously, they're great at reducing emissions from local air pollution, but they could potentially be fueled by other means. But like generally, for the problem around acoustics and noise is that we've always had from the combustion engine quite a dominant sound level that awares us of a vehicle's presence, especially where they're as big as a bus. Um, but when they're, as I'm sure most of your listeners have experienced with electric vehicle, they can, at very low speeds, be almost silent. So you don't necessarily know that something is coming up towards you and potentially is at risk of collision. For a large vehicle like a bus, which is a public, obviously, organisation like Transport for London, there's a liability there. They need to actively try and reduce those risks and the collisions and obviously the incidents that occur. Coming into it, it kind of come about that this was kind of a discussion that was being in Transport for London. We were obviously unaware of it, but then they went out to the market to understand who could produce a system that would produce what's called an acoustic vehicle alerting system. And that is something that is, there's a regulation, it's called the UNECE 138, Regulation 138, that mandates how you can create a sound for an electric vehicle to make sure that people are aware of them. And that came into force, or was come into force in the UK around 2021. For all new vehicles, so new designs. And TFL were trying to basically get their bus vehicles to meet that and to work towards that. This is around end of 2018, 2019. Mm-hmm. So they were asking, how can we produce this? Basically asking a very quick question of like, who can put something on the front of the bus and make a sound? Where we started to engage with them and say, hold on a minute, what is that sound? Like, have you thought about design of it? Have you thought about how it's going to affect people? Have you thought about this balance? And it's, immediately as an acoustician, you think, like, what a wasted opportunity of reducing noise in cities. We're going to start putting sound on the front of buses. Mm-hmm. Like, what? But when you start to think about it in terms of the risk to society, especially for more vulnerable people who are using pedestrians, cyclists, etc., it's quite a critical issue. And it started to introduce, so, okay, fine, we might need to put a sound on it, but what does the regulation say? What scope have we got to kind of create a sound that feels like it's, you recognize it as a bus? It's not going to sound like some bird coming past or a bicycle or something. That would be kind of a bit odd. And so, like, what does it actually sound like? And when we asked that question, they were very much like, we hadn't thought about that. So we actually brought in some of the TFL team to a listening kind of test where we developed an example of lots of different electric vehicles as they were currently coming out at that time. Mm-hmm. Like the Renault Zoe, I think, was one. There's a few others that we just superimposed them onto a London environment and made them listen to it.
I do interrupt for a sec to structure this explanation a little bit. First of all, for non-Londoners, we do speak about the red buses, right? The famous London red buses, meaning it's an icon. It's an icon you need to design on a sonic way, but many people really care about that. It's not just a bus; it's something which is even representative for London to outside. How do you? And you explained that they weren't even aware about the importance of designing that sound, but still you need to design a bus sound. How do you create a sound that warns people, but doesn't annoy them? Taking into consideration that there are so many people, so many different perception of a sound. So a lot of subjectivity into that. And can you explain the process of creating that sound and testing that sound to understand how to maybe reach the maximum of satisfaction, even if it's possible?
Yeah. First principles, we needed to engage with people in that process. So to answer that question very directly, it's about engagement, feedback, and iteration. The key thing that we did with this project was we brought in a sound composer who was a specialist in this. And that meant that as engineers or acoustic consultants, we weren't kind of leading with the creative exploration around it. It was by professionals who work in composition on a daily basis to a brief. And they had a fixed kind of creative process. So, and that part of that process, we had to figure out for that to solve that problem you mentioned around that subjectivity was around that feedback with a stakeholder group. So there's a few different iterations of that. So there's essentially a range of different sounds that are created. There was context around, like, again, thinking about the brief, what should it sound like? What does the team kind of think it should represent? That included things such as iconic historic sounds, thinking about Mind the Gap type things, the sound of like Big Ben, the sound of the old route master, like trundling along with their big, vibrating the whole shell of the bus, taking those into account and actually saying, well, how do you make something that kind of feels like a bus, like a London bus? There's also a conversation about how it shouldn't just be a London bus, because this is something that TFL want to see, as a bus sound, an urban bus sound, not just a London bus sound. So it kind of steered away from that general
it's not
London
a sonic signature. It's not a sonic signature for London. It has to be international in a way. It doesn't have to be a London signature.
Exactly. That's what we landed on in the brief. And it was very much about safety. And it was like we needed to make sure that the components of that are safe, recognizable as possible. So what happened was it created a range of different examples. Those were then stakeholders were brought in. So people from the Independent Disability Advisory Group, so IDAG, so they're people who can, like vision impairments, maybe other disabilities, impairments, to kind of feedback on this. And also get cycling groups, different other stakeholders across the TFL network to come in and listen to them in headphones initially. And then we actually brought it out on the road and put it on front of a bus in a prototype form with a narrow few different sounds. And then people were, again, asked to hear it in different contexts, in a busy environment, in a quieter environment, when it was moving at different speeds. And that feedback was ultimately what decided the final sound. Because, and they also were brought into the studio as well to tweak the knobs of the synthesizers that ultimately were driving it. And a key thing that we actually developed as a result of that feedback, a direct result of people in the studio, those stakeholders in the studio, was what we call the beacon, which is an impulsive type sound that is actually played when the vehicle moves. So it's like a repeated, like dung, dung. And that intermittent sound was really important to increase the audibility and the awareness of it in quite busy environments. And that's actually been backed up by a lot of research that it just came about from people saying, I want something impulsive so I can realize it's not just a continuous sound. So that's how we responded to that. Yeah. So we actually have two sound components. Obviously, within that, there's lots of different elements of it. But there's a core sound that replays actually even when the vehicle is stationary and idle. And that's a bit like a churning of an engine a little bit, but a lighter sound, a softer sound. And that's continuously playing. And then when the vehicle starts to move, it has a more impulsive sound that notifies that actually the vehicle is moving. And that kind of plays together in uniform. And it will change its pitch as the vehicle increases its speed.
This is the sound of the bus when it's stationary. And we add the beacon layer as soon as the bus moves. Lastly, we had to set the minimum and maximum playback levels of the sound and speaker in preparation for the EU Regulation 138 testing.
Yeah, sure. So there's two kind of ways we approach that. So in terms of the evidence base that you said, obviously the way that we hear, it depends. There's a concept around acoustic masking, and that's very frequency dependent. So if you've got a sound environment at frequency between 200 and 500 hertz, for example, and you've got sounds competing each other at the same frequency, you're going to hear the one that's of the highest intensity, essentially. So in order to make something audible, you need to shift it away from where the main frequencies are audible from the ambient sound or background sound. So we actually looked at that in terms of what the typical urban environment would look like, and trying to find where actually it's best to design sounds to fit into the dips, essentially. So where is it actually doesn't have to fight so hard, and you can actually have a lower level in terms of decibels for those frequencies. So we used existing data that we had at lots of different sites around London, which we did surveys of, look at the frequency response of the environment, and tried to find those pockets of frequencies that are more efficient. And in terms of the sensitivity around comfort and acceptability, what the principle that we took in the early stages of the development of this is, yes, we need to look at audibility and safety, but we also need to look at the other side of the extreme. Is you've got people on the side of safety that are like, I need to hear a sound because I'm, potentially can't see the vehicle, or I'm at risk and I need to hear it immediately. On the other side of the spectrum is people who are completely safe. They're not even in any risk whatsoever. Maybe they're not even on the road. They're actually just sitting in their homes, and they don't want to hear this because they don't need it. And that's when it gets annoying, right? So the extreme cases, I don't need to use that for safety. I don't need to hear it. So stop it, please. So we treated the extreme cases. We were trying to design for those two cases. So design for audibility, design for when people don't need to hear it. And what we concluded and we kind of developed as part of the TFL system is a responsive system, we call it. So it actually adapts the sound volume depending on the environment that it's in. So if it's in a quieter street, it reduces the level based on the mapping data that we have of estimates of the levels. Yes. Yeah. Yes, it's geolocated. It's not based on microphones. We did explore that in the early stages in terms of listening to the actual environment, but there's lots of complications with installing microphones onto vehicles, because these vehicles are, out on the road 24/7. Most of the time, they're going to they're too temperamental to have that. It wouldn't be robust enough. These things are jet washed as well. You need them to be completely waterproof. It didn't work. So what we chose to do is mapping. It's quite computationally heavy. Like the systems that go on need to be robust, streamlined, and they need to operate for years without, hopefully too much maintenance. So yeah, the mapping option was chosen. We had fairly good data across London around for the mapping of the approximate noise levels exposure. We also cross-referenced it with other data, such on the road type, and also whether it is a bus route, for example. So yeah, we have data across all of London that it responds to give a good estimate of whether it should be at a high level. But the change in level that we've implemented is only a range of 9 decibels, so it's not huge, but it means that you can soften that when it's on a quieter road, and it changes between the day and the night as well.
When did you implement that sound on the London buses?
So it was at the beginning or the end of 2020, actually.
Okay.
But it was actually first installed at the end of 2019 on a few vehicles, and it's been rolled out over the last 5 or 6 years to thousands of vehicles.
Did you soften the sound during COVID? Because I guess it was a very quiet time to test the first perception. And the real question behind is, did you survey or analyze the impact of that sound in terms of safety, but also in terms of comfort and noises for inhabitants?
Yeah, so we didn't respond directly to COVID because that was quite a intense time, we
Unexpected.
didn't necessarily have that data, but it was being developed at that stage, the responsive system. But what we did do at that stage was actually introduce it at its lowest level. So when the AVAS was introduced, it was at its lowest level, and then because it was still the fixed system, and when we started to introduce the responsive system and test it, we were slowly increasing that up. So then people weren't just suddenly, it wasn't suddenly at its loudest level, and people were like, they could really potentially get frustrated or understand what is that, as that could also cause risks as well. So the idea was that actually you can slowly introduce it into the city. In terms of, sorry, what was your second question?
So it's a question about measuring the impact on in terms of noise and satisfaction of inhabitants or even tourists. But I mean, because I guess you have a lot of tourists too, even in terms of safety for people not used to that sound. It's maybe even worse.
True. So the testing that was done in the development phase was trying to look at, again, people who didn't necessarily know that was the sound of the bus. So it was very much tested in real world environments. We tested it in busy environments, in quieter ones, with people on the street, and what is the time it takes for them to recognize and hear the vehicle. So it was tested like that during the sound development. In terms of the impact to residents, for people potentially who live nearby bus routes, we actually did analysis to look at what the expected noise ingress into buildings would be. And we actually compared that to combustion engines. So we obviously had measurements of existing combustion engine bus vehicles. And we were looking at actually what the noise ingress through a typical window was, whether it was open or also closed. And because of the frequency differences, there's a lot of low frequency energy in combustion engines. We didn't have a lot of low frequency energy in the sound for the urban bus sound. So you actually, because windows are a lot better at reducing ingress from higher frequencies, mid to high, it meant that actually the resulting level was lower. There was a few frequencies, obviously you can still potentially hear it in some of those very extreme examples that we're testing, but actually it was falling a lot below background, which is around 30 decibels for a typical bedroom, for example. So we're testing to quite the kind of extreme case of if you had a bedroom on a bus route that was a few meters away. But compared to a combustion engine, the case is significantly, actually, it's much better from a conditioning point of view. And that was always sometimes the pushback of like, people know what combustion engine sounds like. Why are we changing it? It's like, well, what are you going to put a combustion engine sound onto a fake one? That was also a proposal by some stakeholders where you say, well, no, objectively, this is reducing the amount of sound and noise that people are exposed to. And it's hopefully making it even safer, because to distinguish combustion engines from each other is quite difficult. But where you make it quite distinct sound, people are much more likely to be able to know this is a large vehicle that I should, make sure I'm aware of.
Making mostly a comparison with combustion engines and not with buses with no sound, even if you always have the contact between wheels and the road, which is making some sound.
Yes.
Maybe a last word on that, because that's always here that 70% of maybe not for buses, but for buses it may be a bit lower, but still a big part of the noise is made from the contact between wheels and road, and not from the engine itself. So even turning the engine to electric vehicles doesn't solve the complete noise issue, and you have to manage that other sound in your set of sound, I guess.
Yes, so the regulation that I mentioned before mandates that you have a acoustic vehicle alerting system under 20 kilometers per hour. So that's actually based on the fact that above that speed, tire noise becomes dominant. So at the moment, as the urban bus sound, it fades out as it goes over 20 kilometers per hour, because it merges into the general tire noise that you can hear. And that's where, I was mentioning before, these vehicles at very low speeds is where the risk is. It's when they're departing, when people don't know they're about to depart and they can't hear the engine starting up, and they're quite close to the vehicle. That's where the main risk is, and that's when it plays. So again, the actual on time of the AVAS sound from the vehicles is actually quite small. It's actually quite short. So actually, in terms of when we're testing the routes, going for a drive on a bus route, for example, the amount of times that it's below 20 kilometers per hour, which is about 16 miles per hour, is quite short because it's when they're slowing down, about to stop, when they're departing. But as soon as they get above 16 miles per hour, a lot of the roads in the UK are around 20 miles per hour limit, that actually you don't have the AVAS playing. So the on time of it is quite short in comparison to combustion engine, which is obviously on all the time.
Okay. At Tranquil City, you kind of try to shape the soundscape of the city. So let's switch the topic and go to another topic. In your research for the UK government, you found that just seeing greenery can make people feel like the city is 10 decibel quieter. Why does that happen? We spoke about electric vehicles and the impact is for sustainability. Having greenery, having parks and so on is for the quality of air. For sure, it's huge, but there is some impact on psychoacoustic and the perception of sound. So maybe explain a little bit of that.
Yeah, so that evidence review, we reviewed over 200 odd papers for a variety of different green infrastructure types about what the question was, what were the acoustic benefits of it and what was the evidence behind what acoustic benefits green infrastructure can actually provide. And that was one in terms of physical changes, so reductions in sound intensity, but also in terms of our perception of sound. And that finding that you mentioned was one of the most, the standout ones of the research. What we found was, when you see greenery, you perceive road traffic noise, specifically road traffic noise, to be 10 decibels less than it would be if you were looking at a grey urban environment. And the way that works is it's about that subjectivity and about that context of how you're hearing that sound, because it's very much the same as if you hear your neighbor playing music that you like, or you know your neighbor quite well. You're very much more accepting of it than if you don't get along with your neighbor, maybe
Feel
you don't
like
know
your neighbor.
them, and also if it's depending what time of day it is, etc., what mood you're in, it's the same decibels potentially, maybe even the same sound, but the fact that you know and interact with them and you feel comfortable with a bit of control, maybe you can actually go and talk to them and say, can you turn that down please, because you don't feel like you're going to be, it's going to cause a conflict. It changes the way that you perceive it.
Seeing a tree is the same as knowing and liking the person playing music in front of you. That's what you say.
The evidence doesn't show that, but what I'm saying is that how important the subjectivity aspect of it is. So it could have we don't know actually, the research didn't really show and try and unpick exactly why looking at greenery has that effect. But interestingly, if you compare it to aviation noise, it actually showed the opposite effect. So if you were seeing greenery or in a green space and you heard a plane come over your head, you actually perceive it to be 10 dB higher than it actually is. So if you're in a green space, if you're not in a green space, sorry. So that for me just shows it depends on how the type of sound source as well, but it's so our perception of sound is so varying when you think about the subjectivity of it. And I think that the greenery aspect is a lot to do with, I guess, I hypothesize, is a lot to do with our feelings towards it being not an urban environment and a bit of a distraction. So that's my hypothesis around it. It's about more of a distraction. And we found that there is evidence that shows how nature can be what is called can do psychological masking. So instead of it actually, as I mentioned before, around the frequency content, kind of masking the sound, actually positive nature sounds can actually, they're not physically masking you to not hear road traffic noise, but actually it's distracting your attention away from that road traffic noise to the point where you are noticing it less, and therefore you feel like the intensity is less. So there's a variety of different things that could play into that as to why that effect is what the evidence shows.
I have two additional questions to that, but I must refer to other episodes, the advertising break of this podcast, because in saying that I think about 3 different episodes where we mention similar topics. First of all is, and you know him, the interview of Chris Burdick, the American journalist and author of the book Claymore, speaking about that, shaping a positive soundscape and the analyze he did about that. I know you're in touch. I think you even mentioned in that book, I guess, or you know, Chris, and Pascal Van Dort, another episode from Rockwool, is doing a lot of, is an ambassador for Rockwool and is a rock fund in that case, and is speaking a lot about shaping a positive soundscape, about psychoacoustic. Another very interesting episode. Another one, the last episode I wanted to mention, it's in German. That's an interview of someone from the Deutsche Bahn and the subsidiary of Deutsche Bahn, speaking about a meta window. It's a metamaterial based window to be able to see the train, based on the fact that if you see the train, you're not disturbed by hearing a train. But if you hear a train behind a wall, you don't see that. It's something unknown. And people in cities complain about this train noise. They absolutely can't see, and they don't even know if the train is. I mean, we are animals, so you are in danger because you hear that train and you don't know if you need to hide yourself, even if your intellectual brain know that, okay, the train will stay on track and there is less risk that I get hurt by a train in my home. Just seeing a train change that, and that's why they replace walls with windows. So very interesting in terms of psychoacoustic. I stopped advertising about the 3 other episodes. I will mark it in the show note, but I wanted to go on 2 different aspect. You mentioned plane, we go back to that. But first of all, scientifically or technically, is greenery reducing the sound? And every kind of tree, I mean, between the different kind of trees, sound absorption is very different, right?
Yes. So the answer is yes, it does. But it's very context dependent. So when I say context, I mean the type of green infrastructure, how it's designed, how it's placed, where it's placed. But we looked into initially the physical reduction of sound from green infrastructure, and we looked into generally in terms of the master planning of a city. How does the green infrastructure distribution actually change the overall kind of distribution and intensity of sound across a city? We looked into the like tree belts, woodland areas, but smaller areas of trees. We looked into obviously green spaces and how they're designed. I also looked into living walls, green walls, and also green roofs. And we also looked into blue space as well, so water feature, water elements. And so generally it does in varying degrees. So for example, tree belts, if they're at least 50 meters deep and if they're dense enough, they can actually reduce levels by 6 dB or more. So it does provide a noticeable benefit. As I'm sure you've heard the rule on your show before, around 3 dB is kind of the threshold of where we start to notice a difference in sound. So
but
yeah,
you say 60, right?
no,
6 dB. Okay,
not 60.
I said, wow, it's absolutely huge. We check
If
that
it was
again.
60, yeah, we'll be it was
6
silent
dB,
cities
okay.
everywhere. But 6 dB, yeah. But again, like that subjective benefit of seeing trees is actually greater than that. In terms of the distribution of green spaces and green infrastructure in cities, apparently the evidence shows that the more distributed of pattern of green spaces, rather than having, for example, in Paris, you'll have 2 large green spaces either side of the city, and you have very few. You obviously have some, but across distributed across the city. It's changing a bit now because it's very green. But the other city, like for example London, has green spaces distributed across the whole of the city.
Yep.
They're more distributed, the green spaces. Apparently that can actually show that as a city as a whole has reduced noise levels. So it's better to do that than it is to have concentrated large green spaces. And that's probably to do with traffic distribution, spreading it out a bit, and obviously some mitigation in terms
so
of the
some
ground.
parallel between air quality and soundscape quality
100%.
in that pace. And speaking about planes, more and more in cities, you find green roofs, which is, I think, mostly done for the air quality at the beginning. But is there an impact of green roofs versus planes and the sound of traveling? I know in London with I think 3 different airports, it's quite loud in terms of air traffic. So is there something to do having more green roof in cities to change that?
Yeah, so green roofs do attenuate noise from various different angles, which I can explain. But the primary driver for green roofs, from what I understand, is a lot to do with biodiversity. So it's trying to provide more habitat areas. Air quality, they can. I haven't seen any evidence that shows they can benefit depending on their vegetation. But there's a few different types of green roofs. There's ones that just have a less short layer of greenery. There's some that actually have full trees on them, which are obviously a lot more significant, very heavy. But the way that it attenuates noise is in a few different ways. So if you think of them as on the top of a 5-story apartment block, for example, so quite tall, it can actually reduce sound as it travels. For example, traffic noise. It can reduce sound actually going over the top of the building and diffracting over to adjacent areas. So it can actually make courtyards, gardens that are separated by a building actually quieter than they would be without it. They also reduce the sound actually coming in and improve insulation through the roof. So actually thinking about like just physical kind of external, internal sound ingress. So that from a aviation point of view, it does provide benefit, especially even at low frequencies. But that's mainly to do with the fact that you have a lot of soil and mass on top of your building, less about the kind of vegetation. But it's more to do with the fact that you've got probably this amount of at least a foot or 30 centimeters or more of soil just on top of your building, which obviously insulates.
So it's not greenery, it's just volume.
And the greenery has an effect in terms of the diffracting, as I say about before, and actually, reducing the sound as it kind of comes over a building. But aviation has a lot to do with low frequencies, and those won't really be attenuated by the vegetation. But one thing to note around that, there's a limitation, because you're always going to have windows and normal facades on the side of them. So that's, sound comes in via the easiest path, or it's dominated by the easiest path into your home. So if you have a really good roof, but you have poor windows, or you have your window open, that's where you're going to notice it.
And you say in terms of biodiversity, having more bees and birds on our roof will optimize the sound and your perception of the soundscape if you open your windows and so on. This for sure.
Well, that's what, like I said before, in terms of, if I may, that point that you made there around the introduction of more natural sounds and birds and bees, etc., that can provide that psychological masking. So if you hear birds, it will distract you from other noise sources, which can make other noise more acceptable to a degree, obviously, depending how intense it is.
I hope this episode, these words will give a lot of very interesting ideas to other cities, even to London, but other cities in Europe listening to that podcast. And I know there are, because there's, I think, a lot to do. So now I give you a magical power to end this episode, Grant. You are mayor of London, mayor of every city in Europe. It's a magical power, so that's good. And president of Europe, you heard. So you are strongly empowered. Now, I would like to hear how city sounds, let's say in 2035. Imagine your perfect future for a city. How does it sound?
It's a good question. I would probably expect it to sound like, probably the simplest way to explain it is life. I think cities, for me, aren't silent, and they're definitely not silent. They're places where life happens, where people get together, where nature is potentially, plays a role in that, and people feel happy, healthy, and they're socializing. So the way I see or I hear cities in the future will be helping support those healthy, social, happening lifestyles. So for me, it feels like the simplest way to describe it would be, it sounds like life happening, things buzzing, whether that's wildlife, insects, or people.
Thank you, Mr. President, first of all. And second, it's really resonating to me, as I did interview shortly Colombian sustainability media expert from Bogota. And he told me Bogota is a very, very loud city, and it's annoying. And being a father of I think it was a daughter, he told me you realize how loud it is and how uncomfortable it is. And at the same time, he's Colombian. He told me music is life. Sound, loud spaces is live. He does prefer live. So that's why it resonates to me. And I love hearing that live is not incompatible with tranquility. I hear a lot of people tell me I can't socialize anymore in loud spaces, in a restaurant, in parties, but at work or anywhere, because it's so loud. I need to isolate myself from the other. So it's not completely evident, but I think something like 20% of population can't socialize in loud spaces. So I really like your program, Mr. President of Europe and Mayor of London and any other cities in Europe. And it gives a lot of hope that we can shape a better soundscape and not just kill noise brutally. That's perfect. Grant, thanks a lot for your time today. It was really interesting to me. How can you help our listeners in a way, and how can our listeners and watchers on YouTube help you in the other way around?
Yeah, thanks, Julien. It's been a really nice conversation. In terms of Tranquil City, we're kind of working again across cities across the UK, and also looking to work in the UK, in Europe as well. But we're looking at actually doing some pilots around a wellbeing assessment of green spaces. So if anyone has an interest or a nearby green space that they want to implement the framework that we developed, it includes soundscapes as a key aspect. We'd be really keen to hear from you, so you can just go on our website and get in touch with us via our contact us email address. And yeah, so we're looking at pilots to kind of help evidence the benefits, the well-being benefits of green spaces in cities as best as possible. So that'll be be really keen to hear from people who are interested in that.
Thank you for your words. Thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode. Please share the words, comment, like, follow the podcast on your favorite platform. Follow us on LinkedIn as well. Yes, I hope that we'll get it through technology, innovation, but also education, get it to a better soundscape. Grant Lewis-Waters, founder of Tranquil City. Thanks a lot, and to everyone, have a very nice day. Thank you.
Thank you.